Thank you all for being here this morning. Thank you, Miguel, for the invitation. This has been a fascinating workshop. The original request was to speak for 15 minutes on how our expertise informs our thinking about collapse, disorder, disarray, and all of that. Although I suspect the reason I was invited was that Miguel realized that the workshop wasn't depressing enough and needed one case to turn the volume up to 11 for that little boost to push us over the cliff. And if any case is going to push us over the cliff, it's probably this one. The 872-day blockade of Leningrad, mostly by the German armies, 1941 to 1944. This was a moment in time where the human condition, individually, collectively, socially, was under assault. And this is one of the processes and results of that entire affair. These are mass graves at Piskaryovska Memorial Cemetery. I have lost count of how many of these trenches there are. Most of them say 1942. There are approximately 500,000 people buried here. And that is out of a total of anywhere from 1 to 1.2 million civilians who died, greater than the casualties in the American Civil War over this period. There was starvation, there was violence, there was stress, there was insanity. Those who did not end up here might end up in a situation like this, where they're facing the effects of violence, German bombs and shells, alternatively being murdered, being robbed, in everyday survival. Now, we have one city with a brutal war, no clear end or victory at sight, especially in the first winter of 1941-42. Lots of uncertainty, institutional strain, extreme food scarcity, cold winter, not necessarily a competent elite or at least levels down in the state apparatus. Creating what was truly one big prisoner's dilemma on multiple levels. But was this 1917 Petrograd? One equilibrium of the prisoner's dilemma where order begins to unravel in the capital and then spreads throughout the Russian Empire? Or is this Leningrad, 1941-42, the blockade, which starts to move towards the other equilibrium where there's this fine balance between decay and resilience, sometimes some degree of both at multiple levels? What's going on in this particular case? There we go. The key to a lot of this is food. Surprise, surprise. That seems to have been a key throughout yesterday and some of today. The increasing scarcity of food and the hunger that follows shifts these calculations for strategic innovations, for survival, for gain, whatever. That is the cost-benefit calculation between whether one obeys or disobeys to innovate to survive begins to shift. So I can try and steal food and I might get shot. But if I don't steal food, I won't be shot, but I'll probably starve. What the hell? I'll try and steal. At least I might live to survive another day. So these incentives and, in fact, compulsion to innovate beyond the formal rules and the norms of the day just increases, especially once you get into that first winter. By the middle of November, the formal rations are down to 250 grams of bread of low nutritive value for workers in the military-industrial complex. Everyone else is getting 125 grams of bread, if they can find it. That is around a fourth of a loaf today. That's what you're living on. Maybe you can find some chocolate. You're drinking a lot of hot water just so you can keep the hunger pangs at bay for a day. So this is the key to everything. How is it that people survive when you have got a structure that doesn't seem to be working? Now, part of the story is there's a fine balance. It looks as if we're not maybe heading to the kind of dramatic collapse of 1917 Petrograd, but the system is kind of poised on this balance where it could kind of head towards this Mad Maxification, to use a image from yesterday, where you don't have total collapse, but you've got some kind of disorder or at least decay on various social levels. And there's one set of social forces at the higher levels institutionally that seems to be leading in the direction of decay. The first is bureaucratic failure, or in some cases, bureaucratic foobar. There's information and institutional overload and a mismatch of skills and competencies as the state begins to prep up for war. The German invasion, everyone knows it's going to happen, and yet no one's ready for it when it does happen. The Wehrmacht is moving very quickly towards Leningrad, Moscow, and other cities. And you have cadres at the top, those who remain behind, by the way, because some are volunteering for the Red Army. So you've got shortages of personnel who are used to dealing with the Stalinist command economy and propaganda of a peacetime era, where part of the deal is making sure that your factories produce, and if they don't produce, you learn how to paper over differences. That's not going to work when the Germans are breathing down your neck. So the mobilization of resources suddenly shifts, and you have personnel who don't quite have the skills or the competencies to deal with this. And this leads to some fiascos. Now, there are some successes. The evacuation of military equipment and entire factories, not only from Leningrad but other cities behind the Urals, is a minor miracle. The evacuation of people is a different story, however. The initial evacuation, July of 1941, is children, kind of following the example of what happened in Britain during the Blitz. And what happens is families do let their children go so that the party and state officials can take them to the southwest towards the advancing German army, which leads mothers to then get on the trains that are already clogged and bring their children back. Evacuations fail miserably, so that there are more than 3 million people inside the blockade ring on September 8th when the Germans close in. So at the top cadres who don't have the competencies, don't have the skills, even in the NKVD, people are being moved around and aren't entirely sure what they should be doing inside the apparatus. At the same time, we've got these kind of part one and part two, institutional compromise. The interesting thing about the command economy is it's centralized and hierarchical. It's designed for quick mobilization from above. It's almost designed for war. This idea that commands can be given through ministries, and then you can shift production, you can shift the distribution of resources. But the problem then becomes that if there are cadres who are at these nodes controlling resources, there's now the temptation to misuse them. In other words, a structure that could create effective control of resources also creates the opportunities to misuse these, opportunism with guile, to use Oliver Williamson's phrase. So you will have depot managers and their accountants and drivers who have access to food come November, December of 1941 into January, who now have an opportunity to take food, cover it over with the accountants can play all kinds of games, and then start to sell this stuff in point three, competing nodes of dependency, shadow markets within Leningrad. Or perhaps less than shadow markets, these former farmers' bazaars, known as the Rynek system, where Leningrad civilians would go in desperation to trade whatever they possibly had in order to survive. These ration levels, 250 or 125 grams of bread, if they were even bakeries, is not enough to survive. So civilians are taking books, if they have them, paintings if they're intelligentsia, gold watches, whatever they can get their hands on to sell to people who are stealing food from the state. This is reducing the state's dependency power, and it's starting to erode, starting this decay of institutional coherence within the state. And the folks above in Smolny, the headquarters for the military council, know this is going on. So it seems we have the beginnings of institutional decay. This does not look very good. However, things do manage to hold on by their fingertips. And the first is that there is some degree of coherence, will, resilience amongst the elite in Smolny. Andrei Zhdanov, who is the number one in Leningrad, is for the most part particularly worthless in the situation, but his number two, Alexei Kuznetsov, who will be shot in the Leningrad affair several years later, he and a small cohort at the top actually have quite a bit of energy and dedication to the cause. They are reading every communique that is coming from every level of government. They are signing as much as they possibly can. And Kuznetsov is using carrots and sticks, threatens to shoot people, whatever he can to hold the top of the apparatus together. So there's enough coherence at the top that things don't entirely fall apart. There's enough cohesion, enough coercion, and just enough capital to keep the state going. The NKVD, as much as actually NKVD agents are also starving, they manage not to abandon the elite. They still realize for the moment who's buttering their bread. Another side here is this paradox to the shadow markets I talked about before, parasitism. That is, these folks who are stealing bread from depots, from stores, selling it on the black market, actually need the state to get hold of that food. They're not ready to abandon the state just yet because it's actually useful. Now, just as an aside, this is kind of the opposite of what will happen under Gorbachev. you get this kind of parasitism into the 70s and the 80s, and eventually Gorbachev will say, well, why don't you guys actually turn this into legal entrepreneurship? Managers will say, oh, that's great. And the state really will start to collapse at that point. You don't have that kind of liberalization, so your insider entrepreneurs actually reproduce the state structure as they're stealing from it, maintaining at least some degree of symbolic, if not institutional, coherence. So overall, for the top, hierarchy and centralization creates the risks of institutional overload, bureaucratic failure. Structures and incentives can create opportunism. But what we get is this disaggregation to a slightly lower level where there's enough of an equilibrium of resilience without surrendering all coherence. That is a devolution to a more flexible system, as it were, that can cope with stresses and strains. This kind of reminds me of James Q. Wilson's discussion of the French versus German armies at the beginning of World War II. The German army was actually designed to be more flexible, and that gave it an important strategic advantage over the French army. Note that none of this was, by the way, a desired strategic decision. The folks in Smolny, the folks running the show, did not want to devolve any power, but they were faced with this decay and eventually started to kind of wink at it and let it be. Now, this is at the top. We could still have this Mad Maxification, maybe I should use that term somewhere, of lower levels of order. For example, families, communities, friends. And the story on balance is one of contested cooperation. I don't want to oversell that everything was hunky-dory amongst families and friends. There was quite a bit of tension, a lot of stress, as you would imagine. Families like to yell at each other. In normal times, if you're starving and you're worried about when the next bomb is going to fall on top of you, this increases that stress even more. You do have minor cases of theft. This is kind of hidden between the lines of diaries, but you might have brothers or sisters kind of stealing little scraps of food from each other. But for the most part, you don't have major opportunism at family levels, which you would expect if you follow Peter Sorokin's work on starvation and norms and the late Sergei Yarov's work on the blockade itself. He has this thesis, there's a degradation of norms. But something ultimately holds together at the bottom level as well. And here are four things that are kind of combining. Adam Smith, we're in the economics department. Of course, we've got to bring in some economists. Adam Smith, who noted that empathy is actually quite important in holding things together. It's not simply interests that allow us to interact, but our capacity to see through other people's eyes and allows us to identify with them. Gary Becker, it's going to sound weird, but Gary Becker's definition of love is actually quite important here. M sub I loves F sub J if F sub J's well-being enters into M sub I's utility function. In other words, economists on love, that's got to fit on the Hallmark card somewhere. This idea that our individual utility is actually embedded in social relations. That Gary Becker, in a sense, undercuts the atomization of rational choice theory. Who we are is dependent upon others. And I'm going to mix Becker with Simone de Beauvoir in a second. Prospect theory, this idea that as we calculate, we're actually risk averse. And so we won't simply be risk averse vis-a-vis ourselves, but vis-a-vis these others who are incorporated in our quote unquote utility functions, which will lead to anchoring. We're anchored not only in our own interests, but we're anchored in social relations that actually become quite important. Now I got 2 minutes and 51 seconds. Let's see if I can talk even faster than I am now. One dimension that when we bring this all together, is at these lower levels, empathy, distance, and dignity actually become quite important in shifting from the Nash equilibrium of the prisoner's dilemma, where it's a war of all against all. I'm going to save myself, screw everybody else. It becomes easier to steal from faceless bureaucracies, somewhat easy to take stuff from people on the street whom you do not know. But one thing that comes across in diaries is it becomes increasingly difficult to act opportunistically vis-a-vis someone who you see up close suffering. Seeing suffering visibly, for the most part, seems to matter. In part because you've got empathy suddenly getting activated. When Leningraders are starving, they see someone else starving, they can respond to this. Along with this is also dignity. There's compelled rational action. We will do whatever we can to survive. But at some point, breaking all the rules and norms, the Leningraders ask themselves about this. What have we become? Survival isn't simply, I will do whatever it takes to survive. Maybe it's worth dying, but standing up for some degree of order, especially in the face of German atrocities. The German attack is so ferocious that all of a sudden dying with dignity becomes important. It becomes part of the survival story. So if you add this up at the bottom, as well as what Sorokin clearly saw as forces that would tear things apart, individual survival, seem to be these ordering forces as well. Where this gets particularly interesting, I'll go through this very quickly, is when the sense of self gets involved with the sense of some kind of other. Now, Simone de Beauvoir, in talking about gender, noted that women in interpatriarchal communities are constructed in terms of the other. Woman exists to fulfill the needs of the other. She's reflected through the other. Let's add this with Gary Becker's hallmark definition of love, and what you get, and risk aversion, prospect theory, Daniel Kahneman, you get this risk-averse behavior vis-a-vis close significant other entities, especially children are big in this, who become part of my sense of self. We see this especially, this is fascinating, who wants to read it, I published a piece on this, about women. Women before the war, they have to deal with lower level jobs, and they are especially, as is the case in the US, they have to deal with the second shift. Find food, use it while the husband goes and does whatever. Now, this is certainly inequality during the peacetime era, but man, that second shift becomes an incredibly important set of survival skills when there's no food to be found. Women not only are in factories, because a lot of men are at the front, they also have the skills to save the city, to save mates, to save children, etc. But at the same time, what's fascinating about diaries is they see this as a duty. This is what it means to be a woman. This is what it means to be a mother, to be a wife. This sense of other is implanted in this kind of gendered habitus. I knew I had to bring Bourdieu in here somehow. But mothers become linked to children. Children are linked to teachers. What happens is there are these core sets of relations. I'm really going to go by this. This is about 5 chapters in a book. Ends up linking people not only into these close networks, but into wider fields of relations. So there's something about empathy, something about sense of other, and something about dignity that ends up creating these ordering forces below and avoiding the full-blown prisoner's dilemma, Nash equilibrium at the bottom. So just as for higher level order, there might be some kind of primordial equilibrium grounded in empathy, distance, and anchoring. And with empathy and risk aversion, it seems that we are creatures of order. So overall thoughts: disaggregation from bureaucratic failure leads to lower equilibrium. It seems to be flexible, maybe not quite robust, but flexible enough to cope inadvertently, accidentally with disaster. But centrifugal forces of opportunism can also become centripetal at the same time, and the question is how they balance. And at the lower levels, distance and empathy, anchoring of ourselves shared by that we share, can create lower level fields that become robust. Complexity to simplicity, maybe this is part of our order. Of course, this is one case. How generalizable can any of this possibly be? And in fact, there's a danger in generalizing from one case, which is an incredible temptation, so I'm going to try it anyhow with entertainingly wild speculation. Number one, yesterday morning, Miguel talked about the inverted U curve. Well, he's got it. I sometimes wonder if we can model this, or at least think of this metaphorically, as an inverted U curve between degree of threat and innovations that can actually break down order. If we think of the x-axis as increasing threat, objectively but also felt, and the y-axis is this likelihood of innovating, as things start to unravel, we will think we need to innovate for gain, we will be compelled to innovate for survival, but at some point, as we see in the blockade, threat becomes so great that innovations only add to uncertainty. And in fact, we will defend what we know as a matter of resistance, but also as a matter of survival. That is, it might be that what helps order survive is too much risk, is too much of a threat. Thank you very much, and enjoy your lunch.